Is that how it's going to go? It wasn't as if she was tied up or anything. And what sort of hostage would smile like her? How would a noble woman get out here if they didn't want to be here, anyway? Was demi-humans kidnapping noble women just a thing that regularly happened in Roble? Worry not, my fair lady. The young man in plate armor continued, wheel. The man's voice trailed off and he raised the visor of his helm. His long lance rose into the air as he cast a longing look at her, and his entire squadron followed suit. Florine suddenly felt tired behind her pleasant smile. What are your demands? The man turned a glare at the demi-humans. Florine's companions exchanged glances. I'm getting a bit hungry, T-Cockle said. Some meat would be uk. The reptilian demi-human crumpled forward as Florine's elbow found him. Meat, you say? The man in plate said, in that case. He looked around, eventually turning to find his company of infantry panting heavily as they jogged to catch up to his cavalry squadron. You there? The man pointed a gauntlet to a brown-haired man in the front. Go over to the demi-humans. Eh? You heard me. A noble woman's life is at stake. Why am I not correcting them? Did she pick up Ludmilla's bad habits? She felt compelled to see how far the silly affair would take them. But that's an order, soldier. If any harm comes to her. The soldier sent a helpless look around at his comrades, but no assistance appeared to be forthcoming. He let out a long sigh before looking across the water at Florine. A hand went to his belt as he dropped his spear to the ground and removed his sidearm. 2 daggers joined the other weapons. Florine wondered what the penalty for disobeying insane orders in Roble was, though she had already developed a sense of what was going on and she didn't like it one bit. Mud squished under the soldier's boots as he hesitated on the opposite shore. Florine held out her gloved hand and made a beckoning gesture to coax the man forward. Though he was clean-shaven, she could still tell that he was of middle age, making him a good deal older than the rest of his company. It was also probably why he was the first to catch up to the cavalry. He had survived his duties for long enough to gain a significant enough level advantage to run longer and faster than the others. From a mundane perspective, it would simply be perceived as having superior physical conditioning. He survived that war and much more. Now, they're throwing him away for a pretty face. Now that she knew about levels, Florine understood that the culture that came hand in hand with the faith of the Six turned out to be right about a few things. While the young possessed potential, the older, wiser, and more experienced held more immediate practical value. This was because they tended to have higher levels and could thus do more. In the predominant culture of the North, youth was equated with strength and virility, so the young were favored over the old. The old were seen as disposable unless they possessed freakish strength or incomparable talent. The man blushed as she took his hands in hers and offered him a warm smile. Thank you for coming to retrieve me, brave sir, she said. Might I have the honor of knowing your name? It's Vidal, milady. Just Vidal. Then, Vidal, Florine said as she gently turned him around and took his elbow. Could you guide me back to your company? Please. Florine looked down at the stream, pulling in her shoulders to make herself look small and vulnerable. Vidal straightened and cleared his throat. Of course, milady, he said. It'd be my pleasure. Vidal led her across the stream under the envious gazes of the men on the other side. The man in plate almost seemed angry that he had returned undevoured. You're dismissed, Vidal. The man performed an awkward salute and took a step forward, but Florine refused to let go of his arm. Please let him stay a while, she breathed as she pressed herself against his arm. I'm still so very frightened. A strange sound that Florine couldn't figure out how to describe came out from the knight, or whatever he was. Behind him, the expressions of the mounted men turned ugly. This wasn't the agreement. The man in plate said, you were supposed to stay with the demi-humans, Vidal. Yeah. One of the mounted men said. Go to hell, said another. Get eaten, you old bastard. Florine sighed inwardly as the imagined bonds of brotherhood between fighting men that she always imagined to exist crumbled under the cruel weight of reality. She hated that her mother was right about so many terrible things. Beauty was a weapon that could bring about the downfall of castle and country where all else failed. She looked up at the leader of the company, who in turn was looking down at her with a somewhat disgruntled look. Despite having an Endure Elements enchantment, the Abelian Hills looked so stupidly hot that she felt obliged to dress the part. She was fine with that since there weren't any other humans around, but, now, she was using Vidal's arm to conceal her cleavage. "I don't believe I had your name, Captain." The man removed his plumed helmet, his long blonde locks tossing in the wind as he turned up his head proudly. "Lord Reynaldo da Silva. The Baron Vera once my peasants finish clearing the land." "You were so proud that he sabotages his own attempts at seeming important." Since he claimed that he would be the Baron Vera, Reynaldo da Silva bore Lord as a courtesy title from his house. Somewhere in the Holy Kingdom of Roble, there was a Count da Silva and Reynaldo was one of his spares. He should have referred to himself as Lord Reynaldo, but he included his house to make himself seem more lordly. That might have gotten his introduction a pass by some, but, by adding the latter part about becoming a baron and treating what were probably borrowed laborers as property, he revealed himself to be an insufferably pretentious child. With the bit of information brought to light, Florine supposed that the cavalry squadron was made up of his personal lackeys and the infantry company was considered battle fodder. She wondered how much respect Reynaldo da Silva commanded, and how much he had bought. No longer interested in seeing how things would play out, Florine altered her bearing. She released Vidal's arm, shedding her timid posture and inclining her head slightly in response to Lord Reynaldo's greeting. Florine Cadia Dale Gagne, a baroness of the Sorceress Kingdom and viceroy of the Abelian Special Administrative Area. The tip of the lordling's lance jerked suddenly as he nearly dropped it. His dumbfounded expression shattered his facade of fabricated importance. The leering looks of the riders behind him turned fearful and their eyes swiftly left the open neck of Florine's dress. In the back, the infantry company turned attentive, as if they expected something interesting to happen. "That's right, Lord Reynaldo. Those who so desperately attempt to leverage authority are terribly weak to it, and it looks like everyone here knows it." He was hopelessly outmatched with a mere exchange of introductions. With this turn, she could probably tell him to go and eat mud directly from the stream and he would jump in face first with a gleeful smile. Not that she had any right to, but he probably didn't care about that even if he knew. "To what might we owe the pleasure of your visit, Lady Gagne?" Lord Reynaldo asked. Florine considered her response. As slimy as the man was, it was probably better to turn the situation into a favor to use as currency in future dealings with the Holy Kingdom. That favor wouldn't be collected from Lord Reynaldo, of course. It would be from whomever he answered to. The challenge would be turning what was currently a problem rooted in differing worldviews into an opportunity. "A number of our citizens came forward with petitions concerning the ongoing developments along our shared border," she said. "Developments?" Lord Reynaldo brought a hand up to his chin as he tasted her lead. "Developments? Ah, you must mean that." Well, that was predictable. An individual of his caliber would always have 1 or 10 problems beyond his power to address. Working through them with him would offer valuable insight into what it would be like to have a neighbor like him on the border. "I'm sorry that things have grown to the point that they have been brought to your attention, my lady," Lord Reynaldo said. "Those vagrants and deserters are causing all sorts of problems on our end." "How bad have things become?" Florine asked. "If your issues spill across the border, it may lead to undesirable consequences." The young lordling visibly swallowed, going as pale as the tall sails billowing in the distance. "It hasn't come to blows yet," he said. "But these pests are being difficult. None of the men assigned to the problem can locate their base of operations and they can pop up all along the wilderness to stir up trouble." "Then we'll look into it," Florine told him. "You needn't trouble yourself with our matters, my lady. I have been charged with the administration of the Abelian Hills, Lord Reynaldo. If your matters pose a risk to the Sorceress Kingdom's citizens, then I am obliged to address them. By the sound of it, the efforts of these individuals are distracting you from more important matters, so you only stand to gain from our intervention." A sense of disappointment rose within Florine as a calculating expression fell over Lord Reynaldo. He was so poorly trained that he couldn't keep his thoughts to himself. If the man's observed behavior so far was any indication of his overall quality, she sensed countless headaches dealing with him in the future. "You're right, my lady," he said after a few moments. "We should work together on this. The sooner this issue is resolved, the better it will be for the both of us." "I appreciate your cooperation, Lord Reynaldo," Florine said with a slight smile, "but can you and your escort keep up with mine?" Several of Lord Reynaldo's men let out startled cries as her infantry squads emerged from the vegetation across the stream. The lordling's mount shied away, nearly dumping him into the dirt. At least allow me to send someone along. There are some good men here that can. The would-be Baron of Veer returned to find his lackeys visibly quaking in their saddles. If their mounts weren't frozen in fear, Florian was sure they would have bolted. Each of the men shook his head vehemently as the Baron met their gazes. What's wrong with you all? A disjointed strain of nervous laughter escaped Lord Reynaldo's mouth. In that case, the infantry. How greedy are you, exactly? Desperate for power, desperate for authority, and desperate for credit. His very existence was compromising. She could easily earn another favor by warning Lord Reynaldo's liege of the impending catastrophe that he represented. Mr. Vidal here will suffice, Florian told him. Vidal? Lord Reynaldo turned back to face her with an incredulous look. Surely you desire someone younger and stronger. He appears to be the most experienced out of all of your men, Florian said. Don't worry, he'll return to you healthy and well-rested. We'll contact you if we find anything. Have a pleasant day, Lord Reynaldo. With that, she turned away, taking Vidal's elbow again and guiding him back across the stream. Faced with the undead and demi-humans on the other side, the man started to quake partway across. Don't worry, Florian gave his arm a gentle squeeze. I won't allow any harm to come to you. They entered the shadows of the bush to join her companions. Falagram stroked his beard thoughtfully. I hadn't considered it before, he said, but you hadn't yet added a human to that traveling menagerie of yours. Picked a sturdy looking one, too. You'll be able to get a good bit of work out of him. Vidal's gaze shifted nervously between each member of Florian's party. She disliked how Falagram phrased it, but she was indeed growing a diverse following. What is he talking about? Vidal asked. What is he? Master Falagram and Agni here are dark dwarves, Florian said. I'm surprised you're not familiar with them. There were always rumors of dwarves out in the wild, Vidal said, but I ain't seen any before. The hell you think all that equipment the tribes use comes from? Falagram scowled. Trees? Florian released Vidal's arm, clearing her throat. T-cockle, ZZTZTL. Can you and your companions track down the individuals that Lord Reynaldo mentioned? His description suggests that they are hunters themselves, ZZTZTL replied. It may take some time to locate them if we can at all. Since they're using manual labor to clear the land, Florian said, only a small percentage of the area should be cleared. These hunters should be close enough to actively impede Lord Reynaldo's efforts. I agree, T-cockle said. But it may still take a day or two to track them down. That's fine, Florian replied. We should be stopping to rest soon, anyway. Could you find us a suitable location for a base camp? The demi-human hunters dispersed into the vegetation, but it wasn't long until T-cockle's group returned. He led them north several kilometers to a small, dried-out floodplain between the stream and a low cliff. Several of his hunters were already stationed above as lookouts. Sergeant. The elder lich sergeants and Vidal looked at Florian. She turned to address one of the elder liches. Collaborate with our rangers to come up with acceptable security arrangements for the camp. The second squad can help set up the base. It will be done, Lady Gagne. Her escort moved to carry out her instructions. Vidal goggled at her as she started pulling camp supplies out of her infinite haversack. Meaning no disrespect, milady, he said, but you didn't seem very strong when we first saw you. I don't think I'm very strong, Florian replied. That bundled-up tent must have been 20 or 30 kilos. You just handed it over like a feather quill. If you put it that way, I suppose I do appear stronger than the average woman. I don't really think about it anymore. What about you? I would have thought that the Holy Kingdom's Royal Army would equip their veteran sergeants with something more than mundane kit. The good stuff's only for the best and brightest, milady. I'm just an old sergeant. Florian went over to where the undead had placed some dry driftwood logs around a newly dug fire pit, inviting Vidal to sit with her. She poured out a cup of water and offered it to him. Vidal stared at it for a moment before looking around tentatively. I'm curious, Sergeant Vidal, she said. Why did you become an old sergeant? If I'm not mistaken, mandatory military service in the Holy Kingdom of Roble only lasts a handful of years. I'd be a vagrant otherwise, milady. Vidal finally removed his leather gauntlets and took the proffered cup. You heard the men back there. I'm a bastard. And an orphan, to boot. Is it possible to be a bastard orphan? Sure is. My mother didn't know who my father was. Then, when I was around 5, some demi-humans took a stroll over the wall and raided the port we lived in. I'm sorry. No need to be. He removed his cap and scratched his shaven head. It's a common enough story. Between all the sailors, soldiers, and what have you that took leave there, ahem, forgive me, milady. Shouldn't be so crass in front of a noblewoman. Yeah? Falagrim looked up from the newly started fire. What happens if you do? Vidal sent a glance at the undead around the camp. Depends on her mood, I guess, he said carefully. Or the mood of her escort. Worst I've seen is a drunk bumping into a lady's carriage. Her footman came over and turned him into a cripple. Shouldn't the footman have turned the drunk away before he bumped into the carriage? Florian frowned. Maybe that's why they broke half the bones in his body. A lot of people get hella mad if someone makes them look bad, rightly or no. She shook her head. Florian never imagined that the citizens of a place known as a bastion of good throughout the region would lash out as Vidal described. Footmen were called footmen because they escorted carriages and mounted aristocrats on foot, screening for potential threats to their liege. Allowing any stranger, never mind some random drunk, to reach a carriage was a clear failure in their duties and normally grounds for immediate dismissal. His failure would also be made known to the establishment and its associates, ruining his career prospects for life. So, when do the beatings begin? Falagrim asked. You're acting as a viceroy, right? A vice, oh, shit. Vidal clapped a hand over his mouth. Falagrim looked at her expectantly. Florian rolled her eyes. My escort has been instructed to do nothing of the sort, she said. I can hardly learn about other people if they've been suppressed to the point that they can't be themselves. We'd have slaughtered tribes all over the place if we held them to cultural standards that they're entirely ignorant about. Anyway, I'd like to know more about your service to the Holy Kingdom. There's no need to mind your tongue around me. My service, huh? Vidal settled back down again. Well, life as a wharf rat is generally crap, so I tried getting into the army early. At least with them you stay fed, clothed, and get to sleep with a roof over your head. I kept getting turned away until I was about 12, though. The recruiting officers thought I was just some kid with stupid dreams, not a kid with an empty belly. You didn't say as much? Oh, I'm sure that they knew, milady, Vidal replied. It wasn't as if there weren't thousands of other kids trying to get in for the same reason. That's just the way big, important groups of people are, they do things their own way. It wasn't right to have kids fight, but it was fine to let them starve. Sending children to war was something that the Temple of the Four would loudly disapprove of, so, given their prominence in Roble, refusing early enlistees was probably something ingrained into their culture. Pretty much the only group of people that raised children for war in the northern human kingdoms was the martial aristocracy. The notion would be abhorrent for anyone else who followed the faith of the Four. At the same time, the temples wouldn't even remotely suggest that it was all right for children to starve. It probably boiled down to what they could do something about. The Holy Kingdom could turn away would-be child soldiers, but they couldn't end poverty. Turning early enlistees away was a small comfort to those in authority and a meaningless gesture to those that weren't. Ironically, by doing so, they denied themselves their strongest soldiers. As with any vocation, dedicated warriors who got an early start had an advantage over conscripts rotated in from the general population. Anyway, Vidal continued, once I got in, I think I did pretty well for myself. Sort of. Couldn't hold the line very well, but boy could I put the hurt on someone if they weren't paying attention. I figure getting rid of an enemy quickly is better than trying to slowly chip him down while holding him off. It sounded like he was a rogue. Given his background, it wasn't surprising. I take it that your superiors didn't like the way that you fought, Florian said. Depends on who I was fighting under, milady. If the company captain was a commoner, they loved me to bits. Bought me drinks every time we got back from a patrol that saw an engagement. If the captain was a noble or we had to work under a paladin, then life was hell. Why was that? Vidal turned wary again. Florian looked at him expectantly until he visibly relented. They just saw things differently. Most people who hear that don't think much of it, but it was a huge deal. You had noble officers used to having things go their way and paladins running around trying to keep people on the straight and narrow. Those types have their own idea of how the world works, and there's hell to pay if you don't fit into their grand scheme of things. Even if things are proven to not work out the way that they think. If it don't work, then everyone's dead. What an unfortunate way to develop a bias. If a company survived combat, success tended to be attributed to the commanding officer. If a company perished, there was no proof that it was the commanding officer's fault. Given the way that things seem to be from their discussion thus far, anomalies were likely struck down by the elite elements of the military establishment as a part of their entrenched organizational culture. That sounds like a thoroughly miserable career, Florine said. Better than starving, Vidal shrugged. And it isn't as if it was terrible all the time. Made plenty of friends and did a lot of things along the way. Career-wise, you're probably right. Took me 30 years to make provisional sergeant. Provisional? A sergeant's got paperwork to do. People like me don't get to learn how to read or write growing up. Was in the middle of doing that when the war started. It didn't matter after that. So, you fought during Yaldabaoth's invasion? Sure did. Most of the army got wiped out on the wall and the entire north was mobilized. They dropped a platoon of former conscripts with no officer on my lap and off we went. That's probably a good thing since it'd probably have been some insufferable ass of a noble. Got to skip out on paperwork, too. Florine smiled. It's heartening that you can reflect on the past in good humor. We were dumped into deep water from the start. Vidal let out a helpless laugh. That fucking fiend knew exactly how to hit us. The strongest divisions were all on the wall and wiped out. We lost all of our generals and commanders at the same time. Our queen, the gods bless her kind heart, went to fight with the elite forces of our country and never came back. Without any real officers to lead us, it was a hopeless struggle. Surely you had the commanders of city garrisons and such. Vidal snorted derisively. Those men weren't commanders. The soldiers that they led weren't soldiers, either. Our country has mandatory military service, but money and favors can ensure you a cushy place to serve. Pretty much anyone that wasn't stationed on the wall or close to it bought places that kept them away from battle. Battle came to them anyway. And the women. The sergeant's voice trailed off and he shut his mouth with an awkward look. The women? Florine prompted. A lot of them slept their way to safety. Vidal didn't quite look at her. Those with good looks became mistresses of people who could shield them from conscription. The women who couldn't do that and didn't want to fight got themselves pregnant, so naturally they needed to be protected and put on ships to safety. So, Falagrim said, an army of fiends and demi-humans was rampaging across the country, killing and eating everyone or vice versa. The first thing these women do is get pregnant too. What? Offer appetizers via catapult when their enemies finally caught up to them? Florine's mouth fell open in mute horror at the dark dwarf's implication. How could that thought even cross his mind? Agony sat calmly beside him, entirely unperturbed. Ask them, Master Falagrim, Vidal replied with a tired shake of his head. Makes no sense to me. Anyway, it was a giant mess. The chain of command was broken beyond repair and we ended up with the Grand Master of the Order leading us. Is that particularly bad? Florine asked. A paladin's a paladin, Vidal answered. And a paladin definitely ain't a commander. Once the Order took charge, everything we did was 100% conviction and 0% strategy. We hit what we could hit and got nowhere for it. Things stayed like that until the Sorcerer King showed up. I was wondering about that, Florine said. Since you said you fought in the north, you must have been with the resistance. What was it like fighting with His Majesty? All around them, the undead suddenly turned their attention to the conversation. Vidal cringed slightly at the intensity of their crimson gazes. What can I say? It was like watching a god fight. Anywhere he appeared on the front, the enemy was just obliterated. Some of the spells that he used could cover entire city quarters. Demi-humans became pieces of demi-humans or just bits of char on the grass. Fiends were instantly banished to whatever hell they came from. The only one who put up a fight was Yaldabaoth himself. Witnessing those battles, I used to laugh whenever the bards sang about the 8 Greed Kings and what they could supposedly do. Now, I've seen someone who can do the same sorts of things with my own 2 eyes. Florine looked up at the noonday sky, wondering what it might have been like. Some of the old legends surrounding the 8 Greed Kings had them perform some truly unbelievable feats. As she continued to ruminate, she suddenly realized how late, or was that early? It was. "Thank you for sharing your story with us, Vidal," Florine said. "My companions and I usually operate at night, so we should retire for the day. You're more than welcome to my tent if you so desire." She gestured to her tent, which had been set up long before Vidal finished his tale. Following Ludmilla's suggestion, she purchased one that was large enough to serve as a makeshift office or drawing room and bought several magic items to make it just as comfortable as a luxury suite of a merchant inn. Vidal abruptly stood from his log, looking around while absently wiping his hands on his pants. I should wash up first, eh? Thank you for your consideration, Vidal," Florine smiled. Are you sure about this? We're just so, you know." What do you mean?" Florine looked up at the man. She blinked slowly as his eyes constantly roamed up and down her figure. "This is my fault, isn't it? What I meant was that you should use my tent to sleep in." She wasn't sure what sort of look she should put on. "I have a magic item that precludes the need for sleep, so I'll be doing paperwork throughout the day." "Oh." Vidal visibly deflated. Across the fire, Philagrum let out a snort. "How should I even report this?" Florine tapped her pen against a blank sheet of paper as she sat at the desk in front of her tent, from which an endless stream of loud snores emitted. The potential development of issues along the border with the Holy Kingdom of Roble was something that she had been wary of since being dispatched to the Abelian wilderness, but the problems she was facing now were coming from odd and unexpected angles. "It was a good thing I spent that week with Ludmilla." Was it intuition or simple happenstance? Since she had consciously decided to go to Warden's Vale to consult with her friend, it was probably the former. She was missing something essential in her perspective and she felt that speaking with Ludmilla was a chance to address that deficiency. The problem was that she didn't quite understand what Ludmilla was talking about at the time and was skeptical of some of her most salient points. Philosophically speaking, Ludmilla functioned in an entirely different manner from pretty much everyone else that she knew. It only became apparent when things stopped meshing correctly and all sorts of oddities started popping up. It wasn't until she arrived in the Abelian Hills, where rangers and druids, or hunters and mystics had a heavy influence, did the various topics that they had discussed start to make more sense. Even this early into her work, the fact that nearly everything that she thought would work actually wouldn't was made abundantly clear. She had time to figure things out, however. Lady Albedo was likely well aware of how challenging the task was, given the lack of a time limit and the incredibly low bar she had set for success. Neither Florine nor Lady Albedo was willing to settle for the bare minimum, of course. Unfortunately, domestic affairs that she could take her time figuring out how to address properly had suddenly become wrapped up in foreign affairs. Florine found herself in the strange position of being a human on the side of demi-humans against humans, and the country of said humans had a historically poor relationship with said demi-humans. Said human country was also supposedly on good terms with the Sorceress Kingdom and were following patterns of behavior that they considered perfectly right and normal. "Of all of the things it has to be," she muttered, "why water?" It was so innocuous that one almost wouldn't be wrong to call it insidious. The Abelian wilderness lay in the rain shadow of the southern border ranges, making water a precious commodity. Even on the border with Roble, with its proximity to the sea, the climate was still relatively arid. Beyond the wall, however, Roble had a wonderfully mild climate with plentiful rain driven by the western trade winds. Sticking the Great Wall where it was made it seem like they were trying to keep their little paradise to themselves. No, it was almost definitely the case. Lady Gonye, Isarako asked, would a request for climate amendment not resolve the issue? I'm not sure that it would, Florine answered, but it's an unacceptable resolution. The reckless actions of a foreign power are having adverse effects on the livelihood of our citizens. Roble's expansion is affecting a permanent change, and resorting to climate amendment not only ties up a bit of Lord Mayor's mana indefinitely, but it also doesn't stop Roble from maximizing the damage that they're causing. Actually, it would reward them for doing it. Climate amendment covers a wide area, so their new industrial development will benefit from the expenditure of resources that we are using to fix the problems that they're causing in the first place. Then what would you recommend? I don't have a recommendation yet, Florine replied. I'm not even sure if this is something that can be solved with a recommendation. At its core, It's an issue revolving around a certain perspective and the behaviors that stem from it. Telling them to not do something will only have them stop doing that particular thing in this particular instance. If they perceive benefits in doing it elsewhere, then they'll keep doing it elsewhere. Is that any of our concern? The elder Lich asked. Of course it is, Florine answered. Our foreign policy goals mandate the strengthening of diplomatic ties between the Sorceress Kingdom and the other nations in the region. With those ties come certain associations and responsibilities. Roblé might appear to be stuck on a peninsula, but His Majesty's reign will bring unprecedented prosperity to the region. Those who partake of that prosperity will have the means to expand their influence. If pioneers from Roblé sail off to places unknown and try turning every place they touch into farmland, they're going to end up with a bad reputation and a whole lot of enemies. All of that will transfer to us by association. Would the reaction be so extreme? They're rendering the land uninhabitable for other races, Florine told Isoroku. An antagonistic response is perfectly justifiable. Here, however, we are in a position where we may be able to influence their worldview and thus preemptively prevent problems of this nature from occurring in the future. At least there was that. The good thing about being exposed to new concepts and modes of thinking was that it became easier to perceive and grasp even more after that. They had plenty of opportunity to allow diplomacy and the exchange of ideas to take its course. What if they refused to change their behavior? Isoroku asked. Then we would need to make demands, Florine answered. If those demands are not met, punitive measures would be required to enforce them. Waging war with the Holy Kingdom of Roblé does not appear to be in line with our foreign policy goals. Having a willfully ignorant gang of idiotic allies constantly dragging His Majesty's name through the mud isn't, either. The punitive measures in question don't necessarily have to be war, anyway. It merely has to be an effective deterrent. An embargo that effectively exceeds the economic benefits of developing this land, for instance. Based on what you've shared with me in the past, would that not also hurt the Sorceress Kingdom's economic prospects? Strictly speaking, it would, but the alternative is far worse. As the regional hegemon, we need to show that we can keep the affairs of our own house in order. No one will take us seriously, otherwise. Florine's sense of disgruntlement grew as the discussion went on. She wanted to believe that Roblé would see reason, but the slimy feeling that she got from Lord Reynaldo kept bothering her. If what she had seen so far was indicative of his country's outlook and attitudes, or at least those of the country's decision-makers, the need to resort to punitive measures seemed all the more likely. The problem was that, while she said that a punitive response to their lack of cooperation would be perfectly viable, it wouldn't seem that way to most of the countries in the region. People from places like Roblé and Riestais simply didn't have the same appreciation for water as those from places like the Abelian Hills did. Of course, they understood that one would die without water, but, at the same time, they also considered it a free and plentiful resource. What of the petition about the activities in the bay? Oh, that one's easy, Florine replied. Assuming that everything is as the Monachini claim, what they're doing is unquestionably an attack against our citizens. They're only doing it because they think they can get away with it due to technicalities, and attacking our citizens to pursue historical grievances won't qualify as a valid justification. As far as I know, Isoroku said, our ratified treaties with the Holy Kingdom of Roblé do not cover any of the problematic activities occurring here. Diplomacy is not a static affair, Florine said. I've gone over those treaties, they're very basic and can only really qualify as a single cornerstone of our relationship with Roblé. A fully fledged relationship with all of the requisite agreements will take at least several years to develop, and those agreements must be kept up to date with our geopolitical and socio-economic realities. Since you brought up the topic of treaties, however, it would be a good idea to visit Queen Auriculus. She maintains hundreds of maritime treaties, so she should know all of their ins and outs. Not to mention the fact that every maritime treaty Queen Auriculus maintained seemed to end up creating fast allies, and she had nurtured those relationships to the point that they led to those allies moving to confederate with the Draconic Kingdom the moment it was realistic to do so. If the Sorceress Kingdom could achieve the same success with its ongoing expansion, it could minimize conflict, avoid bureaucratic inefficiencies, and invest more time and effort in productive pursuits. Pip. Florine looked over her shoulder to find Sergeant Vidal emerging from the tent with a yawn. She smiled in greeting as he turned a still sleepy eye on her. Good evening, Sergeant Vidal. Evening, milady, the man rubbed an eye. Coulda sworn I saw a bird on your head just now, maybe I'm still dreaming. You had a dream about birds? Sure. Let's just say it was about that. Excuse me while I go and clean myself up. The sergeant ambled away toward the stream with another yawn, stretching his arms as he went. At first, Florine thought that people were politely ignoring the fact that Leolio was perched on her head, but it turned out that they didn't notice he was there. Even knowing that he was there, Florine couldn't see him whenever she examined her appearance in a hand mirror. Florine rose from her seat and set out a meal from one of her preservation containers. Before Sergeant Vidal returned, however, ZZTZTL and his band appeared from upstream. We believe we have located the humans that you seek, the DRTHR ranger said. They had the air of hunters returning from a raid. We stalked after them until they arrived at a small camp populated by many other humans. How far away are they? Not far, but they are within the buffer zone. Judging by their distance to the edge of the brushland, a single one of their warbands should be able to conduct 4 or 5 raids a day. Are they raiding? ZZTZTL seemed to pause in thought. They do not return overly burdened, but we cannot discern whether they carry any spoils or not. Sergeant Vidal, Florine said as the man came back from the stream, how many times have you encountered these individuals that Lord Reynaldo is having problems with? Since they started doing what they're doing, the sergeant replied, not even once. They're all scouts from the army, so we pretty much got no chance of finding them unless we're already waiting wherever they head next. Course, they'll see us before we see them, so that'd never happen. Florine held out the plate with Sergeant Vidal's breakfast on it. So Lord Reynaldo is just running around to reassure the laborers? Pretty much. The sergeant eyed the meal prepared by Chef Pyrrhus. I didn't know you ate the same food as us. The chef that prepared this was trying his hand at some recipes from your country, Florine said. How does it compare? The chef. Sergeant Vidal glanced at the assorted demi-humans around the camp before receiving the plate. He took a bite out of the battered fillet, filling the air with a soft crunch. He chewed vigorously before swallowing. Not bad. Pretty good, actually. We can only have this sort of thing back in town, and the ends are getting all scrimpy with their portions. Whoever made this didn't hold back. The man took another bite before sticking his fork into a slice of fried potato. Anyway, he said, Lord Reynaldo's losing. He can run around all he wants trying to reassure everyone, but it's become clear that he can't do anything about those scouts. Things are going to turn ugly sooner or later. Lord Reynaldo said that it hasn't come to blows yet, Florine noted. Are you saying that they will? When it does, Sergeant Vidal replied grimly, it won't be between him and the scouts. Florine narrowed her eyes at the implication. I'm not sure I heard that correctly, she said. I'm pretty sure Milady did. The laborers are gonna give up eventually, and that piece of shit's gonna order his men to beat him until they start working again. I can't believe something like that would be legal in the Holy Kingdom. Sergeant Vidal gave her a long look before letting out an equally long sigh. He stared down at the half-eaten meal on his plate. You're a good lady, milady, he said. Real smart, too. Smart enough to know that it don't work that way with people like our good Lord Reynaldo. Florine's sigh echoed Vidal's own. Going by his words, judicial authority in Roble functioned in a similar manner to that of Riastais, Baharuth, and the Sorceress Kingdom. The noble presiding over a fief was responsible for maintaining order and meting out justice. Only a noble's liege and the crown had any right to interfere with the process. Additionally, as it was part and parcel of any contact of vassalage for a liege to defend their vassal in court, any charges brought forward by commoners or outsiders, which included nobles of the same country, would almost always be dismissed. If there was any restitution to be had, it was done privately so as to not undermine the collective authority of the establishment. Of course, this behavior wasn't limited to aristocrats. Guilds defended their members, villages defended their residents, and families defended their relatives in a relatively similar fashion. The main difference was how much authority was vested in the people involved, which in turn dictated how much oversight they could be subjected to. One wouldn't be wrong to say that human law was a product of human nature and whatever ethical paradigms the value systems of a society gave rise to. Since you put it that way, Florine said. Where do you stand on the issue we're investigating? Where a little guy like me stands don't really matter, Sergeant Vidal said, but I guess I'm on Lord Reynaldo's side. I hate the guy as much as anyone else, but the scouts ain't doing what they're doing because they hate Lord Reynaldo. Then why are they doing it? I dunno. Some nonsense about leaving perfectly good farmland alone. It is not nonsense, a hiss escaped ZZTZTL's mandibles. A tribe that does not heed the wisdom of its hunters is little more than a collection of fools. Sergeant Vidal took a step back, his eyes going back and forth between ZZTZTL and Florine. We should meet these scouts before they perform another raid, Florine said. No matter how justified they feel about their actions, those actions are still unlawful. There must be a reasonable way to resolve this. ZZTZTL led them out of the camp, following the shallow valley upstream. Along the way, they ran into Teacockle and his band. I suppose you found them, as well? Florine asked. The human hunters move, Teacockle answered. They have dispatched a small raiding party. Do we have any chance of intercepting them? Yes. They are following this stream to the hewn lands, heading directly toward us. Hide? I don't want to scare them off. Everyone scattered, leaving Florine alone by the stream. She stood there awkwardly, feeling more and more stupid as the minutes passed. What the shit? Nymph. Don't look or you'll go blind. The panicked warning was the first sign that anyone else was nearby. Florine bunched her hands over her chest, peering cautiously about. I'm not a nymph, she called out. It's all right to look. Her mouth snapped shut. What was she saying? The bushes rustled several meters away. Stop, kid. It's a trick. She's going to spirit you away to her bower and ravish you until you never want to leave. A young man roughly the age of Liam stepped out from the bushes. It seemed that the dire warning wasn't effective enough. Hello, Florine smiled. Hi, he smiled back. I've come to speak with your party about what's going on here, she said. Would it be possible for me to speak to your leader? Sure, the young man replied, then looked behind him. Captain. Gods damn it. An older man emerged from the shadows and came forward. I'll talk, so release your hold on my man. I'm not actually doing anything, Florine said. The captain frowned and looked at his subordinate. What? The young man looked back at him. My name is Florine Cadia Dale Gonye, she spoke into the silence between them. I'm currently serving as Viceroy of the Abelian Special Administrative Area. I've received some concerning petitions from our citizens along the border. Would you mind answering a few questions? The Sorceress Kingdom? But I thought that, are you a nymph, after all? I'm a human. Florine lowered her hands, tapping the tips of her fingers together patiently. With whom am I speaking? Like Lord Reynaldo's men, the two in front of her were adorned in the circuits of Roblay's royal army. Unlike them, the scouts were lightly armed and armored. They wore cloaks that blended with the greenery and had a quiver at each hip. The longbows that they held were nearly 2 meters tall. Rico Ortega, my lady, the older man replied. Captain of the 1st Division's 1st Scout Company. It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance, Captain Ortega, Florine said. A rather confusing situation has developed on the border. If you don't mind, could you help me understand what's going on? A bunch of greedy idiots is what's going on, the captain grated. Those parasites are hell-bent on sucking the land dry. Our citizens along the border share in your position, Florine told him. Even so, why did you decide to take this approach? We've heard claims of desertion and vagrancy. We haven't deserted, Captain Ortega spat. We're doing our jobs. Now that the Sorceress Kingdom's taken over the Abelian Hills, we scouts are basically foresters or watchmen depending on where we're stationed. The damn people running things out here aren't listening. I sent my lieutenant to inform the royal court, but these brats won't wait for a response. All we can do is slow them down until someone from Hobans comes out and talks some sense into them. Florine frowned inwardly at the captain's account. Too many things didn't add up. I'm not intimately familiar with Roblay's inner workings, she said, but shouldn't your report have gone to your superiors in Kalinshire? A company captain going straight to the Holy Kingdom's royal court with a problem was about as ridiculous as Ludmilla going straight to the Sorcerer King with one. Captain Ortega looked down at the stream. She could hear his teeth grinding from where she stood. They're in on it, my lady. I beg your pardon? The army's in their pocket. The captain told her, anyone that can legally stop them, anyway. If I sent my man to Kalinsha, they'd burn the report and lock him up. It has to go to Hobans. Who are they? Florine asked. Lord Reynaldo. Reynaldo. The captain sneered and spat. He's just a thug doing his father's bidding. Then who is the cause of this? Too many people are the cause of this, Captain Ortega sighed. Half the country's gone mad with greed and the other half's gone mad from starvation. Reynaldo and his ilk are part of the former, his slaves are part of the latter. Slaves? But I thought they were laborers hired to clear the land. The captain snorted. Technically, you're not wrong. All those starving riches that you saw out there are debt slaves. The war took everything from the north, Lady Gonye. Our families. Our possessions. Our food. More than half of the survivors sold themselves into slavery just so they could eat. But we've been sending you food. Aha. And guess who's responsible for distributing it? The northern nobles might have given a damn about their tenants, but the southern ones that volunteered to help manage things now that they're gone certainly don't treat them as their own. Everything's just an opportunity for them. The food you're sending for free isn't being given out freely, but it's being used to get free slaves. All the lands that have been left empty in Yaldabaoth's wake are prizes to compete over. The wilderness out here is free for the taking now that there aren't any demi-humans to hunt them down. I do not like what I hear, human. ZZTZTL's voice hissed from overhead. The DRTHR detached himself from the branches and landed beside Florine, leaning forward with his dagger-sharp forelegs raised. Captain Ortega rolled back into a defensive crouch, brandishing his rapier and stiletto. Are you saying that these tribes you speak of would wither our territory for nothing? ZZTZTL drilled in a malevolent strain. We fought against Yaldabaoth with the Sorcerer King. I have seen your lands, human. They are lush and green and wet, and we are told that your population is half of what it was before. All have lost grievously, yet your kind reaches for that which they do not need. The creak of unseen bows came from the surroundings. Florine touched ZZTZTL's spiky shoulder. Captain Ortega is not the problem here, she said softly. ZZTZTL withdrew with another, frustrated, hiss, folding his forelegs in front of him. Florine turned her attention back to Captain Ortega. How has it become like this? She asked. What is their motive? I'll be upset if it's simple, unthinking greed. That's all that I can think of, my lady. Captain Ortega straightened again, sheathing his blades with a loud sigh. Everything's just gone wrong. Prince Caspond, he laid out a bunch of policies after the end of the war. Ones that should have gotten us back on our feet real quick. But it all got twisted. Can you recall the details of these policies? They made sure everyone knew, the captain nodded, and they could be understood by everyone. It was all about restarting our industries and rebuilding the economy. Growing enough food for the winter even with the missing harvest and lack of labor. No one questioned it because it all made sense and everyone got to work. The best part was that the prince included incentives that were open to everyone. Such as? Honors. Titles. Stuff that only nobles and heroes usually get. But these ones were for things that even commoners could do. Farmers that could pull in a bigger harvest with more land get to keep the land that they did it with. Fishermen are rewarded for bringing in bigger hauls. Same deal for people pulling in more construction materials. Artisans and merchants are included, as well. More nails, more tools, more infrastructure. Moving more things around. You could even get a title for, what did they call it? Being a promising industrialist. Can you imagine that? A nobody becoming a knight or a baron through hard work alone. That's not out of the ordinary, Florine told him. Any country in your scenario would promote the rise of talented and capable individuals. Offering titles is one of the usual ways a kingdom would do that. Actually, the Baharuth Empire continually does that for exceptional military or civil service. Really? Really? While Roblé was in an ideal location for human habitation, it was also land-starved. The creation of new titles in the generations before Yaldabaoth's appearance was likely a rare, if not unheard of, thing. Anyway, where was I? The people were all about it. It was like they were living a dream with unlimited opportunity. Then, somehow, it turned into a nightmare. I don't know how it happened, but people started to see other people as competitors in the worst of ways. Obstacles. Enemies. But you've just been through a war, Florine said. How could anyone think like that with all the work ahead of you? That's what I thought, Captain Ortega replied. That's what everyone thought. Right up until the point it happened close to home. Then, it was like a sickness took the people's minds. The week before I left Kalincha, I had to respond to 32 workshop arsons, and those were the ones that happened during my shift. Sometimes, one of those damn workshops got attacked multiple times on the same day. One time, a labor camp run by a rich fellow was hit and the night wind drove the blaze straight up the coast through the refugee camps nearby. 20,000 people died, just like that. Even farmers were getting in on it, lighting their neighbors' fields on fire if they think they're going to lose. Then, the retaliation, it never ends. Florian could only respond with a dumbfounded shake of her head. What in the world was going on? For some stupid reason, her only coherent line of thought was that she was thankful it wasn't Yaldabaoth's doing this time, at least. That's when I left, the captain said. I just couldn't take it anymore. Demons and demi-humans, I can fight, but watching my own people eat themselves alive like that after all we've been through, I took the other men who were just as sick of it as I was and came out here where we thought we could at least do some good. Captain. Someone called out from the bushes, it's Rodriguez. Rodriguez? But he's, shit. Beg your pardon, my lady. Bring him over. A short, dark-haired man in uniform appeared from the side. Captain, where the woe, a nymph? Sure, why not? Florian smiled. What happened? Captain Ortega asked. That should be our line. Rodriguez answered, we waited for so long that a patrol found us. Some of the men got caught by Reynaldo. Captain Ortega cursed under his breath. Apologies, my lady, he said, I need to go and rescue my men. Will you resort to violence? Florian asked. Knowing what Reynaldo will do, the captain answered, I don't have any good options. Then allow me to come with you. Perhaps I can offer an alternative solution. The captain nodded once before walking past her and down the stream. Before they reached her camp, he went up an animal trail, heading west. If you believe their lives are at risk, Florian said, I could demand that you and your men be released to my custody. You've been basing yourself in the buffer zone, after all. What's the penalty for that in the Sorceress Kingdom? Our judicial processes are very comprehensive, Florian told him. Your presence and activities in the buffer zone would be considered policing measures, so, if there are any penalties at all, they would be superficial. Unfortunately, I can't say what would happen should you return to Roblé after that. Their pace slowed as they approached a different part of the same clearing that Florian had visited the previous day. Harsh voices carried on the night wind reached them long before they came out of the snarl of vegetation. Serves you right, criminal scum. Let him have another lick. An anguished cry filled Florian's ears, transforming into a hoarse shriek. The laughter of dozens of men rose in accompaniment. Captain Ortega stormed forward, knocking an arrow to his longbow. What the hell do you think you're doing, Reynaldo? A cacophony of shouts came in response, punctuated by the ringing of drawn steel. Florian emerged to find Lord Reynaldo's men facing the edge of the clearing with arming swords in hand. From the vegetation, over 4 dozen longbows were leveled at them, arrows nocked and at the ready. On one end of Lord Reynaldo's group, Lord Reynaldo himself stood near a small tree, torch in hand. Next to him, a naked man dangled from a branch by his bound wrists. Tears dripped off his chin as he weakly wept. Disciplining a deserter, of course, the lordling said. As is my right. You're no baron yet, Captain Ortega snarled. In response, Lord Reynaldo smiled and shrugged. Then he shoved his flaming torch into the dangling man's crotch. The lordling's smile grew into a savage grin as the man thrashed and shrieked again. Were you going to do something? Lord Reynaldo asked. Oh, that's right, you can't. You have no authority here. This isn't your post and you're certainly no rebel, or so you claim. The men and women of the scout company sent glances at their captain. Captain Ortega fixed Lord Reynaldo with a stone-faced glare. If Baraja was here. Baraja? Lord Reynaldo snorted, the night watchman? The cornerstone of our great wall's defense? Or do you mean his paladin whore? Even if your mentor was alive, how could you imagine that anyone who failed to defend our country could have any clout in this situation? Surely you don't mean their raving lunatic of a daughter. Have you no sense of gratitude, you bastard? I am no bastard. Lord Reynaldo roared, "I am a true-born de Silva, and you are nothing but a vile traitor. Seize them." Captain Ortega's bluff called, Lord Reynaldo's men advanced with cocky smiles. "Stop." Florine stepped out from her place in the bushes. Lord Reynaldo's men faltered, exchanging confused looks with one another. "Ah, Lady Gagne," Lord Reynaldo turned his disgusting smile on her. "As you can see, I have everything under control here. You may return to..." Silence. A line of crimson gazes emerged from the shadows as her escort appeared from the brush. Florine walked over to the tree, looking up at the burnt ruin of the man hanging there. "Free him." Her shadow demon flickered into the darkness above the branch, slicing apart the rope suspending the tortured soldier. Florine clumsily caught him and knelt to rest his head upon her lap. Oozing cuts covered his bruised body and his eyes were swollen shut. The flesh of his legs and hips was burnt and cracked, peeling back to expose the bone beneath. She reached into her infinite haversack for a healing potion, pouring it out over the man's wounds. Rather than sigh in relief, he screamed in renewed agony as his flesh returned and then stopped healing partway. Florine quickly used another healing potion, stroking the man's sweat-soaked hair. His screams turned into a whimper before he finally fell silent, chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Florine finally turned her attention to the power-drunk reprobate. "What could possibly possess you to do something like this?" Her furious gaze went to the lordling's men. "How could you simply watch? Laugh? Is this what the Holy Kingdom is like? The proud bastion of our faith?" The only answer to her questions was silence. That silence, however, was eventually replaced by the thunder of distant hooves. Points of light appeared in the darkness, resolving into torches held aloft by a column of shining plate mail and spotless barding. When they finally came into the range of her dark vision, Florine noted that their circuits did not sport the colors of Roblay's royal army, instead displaying the Holy Kingdom's crest in cerulean on a field of white. They brought their warhorses between Reynaldo's men and the line of undead. The man at the head eyed both sides before he spotted Lord Reynaldo. "Lord Reynaldo," he said in a strong, steady voice. "Would you care to explain what's going on here?" The lordling opened his mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out. Florine let out an annoyed breath before releasing him from her hold. "I can talk?" Florine's lip twitched as his question was received with a dubious look by the new arrivals. Lord Reynaldo coughed and cleared his throat. "As you can see," he told them, "I was about to bring these deserters to justice, but their activities so close to the border have dragged the Sorceress Kingdom into it. The demi-human raid yesterday was their fault, as well." "Oh, you just didn't. You pile of lanka dung." Captain Ortega shouted, "I'm going to put an arrow through your lying tongue." "Brother Sanchez," Lord Reynaldo said, "could you please deal with this unreasonable warmonger?" "What?" "Ortega," Brother Sanchez said. "Hoban sent word about you sending your man to them." "Good. What did they say?" Brother Sanchez reached into one of his saddlebags, producing a scroll with a wax seal. He unfurled the parchment as one of the other riders drew close with torch aloft. "By order of His Royal Highness, Prince Caspond Besserace, Captain Ortega of the 1st Division's 1st Scout Company, along with the 1st Scout Company as well as any other service members accompanying him are ordered to return to their posts. Amnesty has been offered for your transgression so long as you resume your duties at once." "But what about the report I sent along with my man?" Captain Ortega said. "Lord Reynaldo has been destabilizing the border with his reckless actions. He's making the people work all day on half rations and he was just torturing one of my subordinates not 5 minutes ago." "My orders only concern you, Captain," Brother Sanchez said. "I haven't been authorized to do anything else. You can make your report with the garrison commander when you get back. Honestly, the order is already swamped with everything that's going on. The country's best scout company running off like this only means that the people suffer all the more." A long silence fell between both parties. Florine pondered the surreal scene. On one side, a rank of Death Knights was covering a group of soldiers fighting to do what was best for the Holy Kingdom. On the other, a rank of paladins was protecting a collection of villains dragging the Holy Kingdom into a mire of corruption and moral decay. Truly, truth was stranger than fiction. The silence was finally broken by a long sigh as Captain Ortega stepped out between the Death Knights. He walked before the row of paladins, casting a withering glare at Lord Reynaldo before kneeling to check on the condition of his subordinate. He's all right now, Florine said. I used 2 high-quality healing potions. They're made from the finest ingredients in Warden's Vale. Warden's Vale? The fief of a friend of mine. She's a ranger running a frontier territory, so it feels like wildland more than anything else. Huh? Captain Ortega said. That'd be a sight to see. I can still arrange for it. Captain Ortega rose to his feet again. I appreciate the offer, he said, but you heard Brother Sanchez. I'm a son of Roble, Lady Gagne. My battle is here. By the way, what will happen with the border? What's going on here affects our citizens, so you can be sure that something will come through the official channels. Good, the captain nodded. In that case, it's time for us to get back to work. It's been a pleasure, Lady Gagne. You remind me of our late queen in a lot of ways. A pair of Captain Ortega's men came to carry the tortured man away. Florine stood by silently as she watched a long column of men and women disappear into the night. When the last of the soldiers vanished, she suddenly realized that the slimy sensation that she had associated with Lord Reynaldo was still there. It didn't take long to pin down what she was feeling. This country is sick. It was several orders of magnitude worse than Facet County. Something unspeakably vile had infected the kingdom of Roble.